Good morning, class. This is Father Kilian back again. Thank you once again for those of you who submitted your reflection papers, and I appreciated that. And I also had several emails from a number of you regarding the final exam and your concerns about that. And I'm in the process right now of putting the final exam together. And I will send that to you most likely by not this coming class, but the Friday's class. And you'll get that, and you'll have a chance to look at it. And then perhaps you might have some questions about it. But I'll try to be as clear and as sort of clearly stated so you'll understand exactly what you can expect for the final. Okay, so... But what I'd like to have you do for Friday's class is I'm going to give you three questions that deal with our very final story, Revelation. And I'd like to have you select two of the questions that I'm asking you, and then if you get those back to me on Friday, that would be great. So they're not very complicated, but I just want you to be thinking about these questions so that when we come to Friday's class and where I'll discuss with you Revelation, you'll at least have had that background you've been thinking about. And so anyway, here are the three questions that I would ask you to be thinking about, and if you could also write up a response to the three questions and send those to me. The first question regarding Revelation is that why does O'Connor use a doctor's waiting room for the opening scene in Revelation? What purpose might it serve? As we read in the opening paragraphs of the story, we meet all of the characters in the doctor's waiting room. Why do you think she used the doctor's waiting room as the opening setting for her story? Okay, that's the first question. The second question I want you to think about is regarding the protagonist of this story, and that's the woman by the name of Ruby Turpin. Ruby Turpin appears as a kind of friendly, neighborly woman. You know, a kind of a likable person as we meet her for the first time as she and her husband walk into the doctor's office waiting room. Yet, why does she get targeted by Mary Grace, the young university student who's there in the waiting room with her mother? And we read on page 497 of our text the following, I quote, "To help anybody out that needed it was her philosophy of life. She never spared herself when she found somebody in need, whether they were white or black, trash or decent," unquote. So that's a statement that comes from the third-person narrator about her. So again, she seems to be this friendly person, a nice person. Why is it that she gets targeted by Mary Grace? Okay, that's your second question. And the third question I want you to think about is this. How do you explain Ruby Turpin's argument with God at the bottom of page 507, where she yells at God? "Go on," she yells. "Call me a hog. Call me a hog again from hell. Call me a warthog from hell. Put the bottom rail on top." And then a final surge of fury shook her, and she roared, "Who do you think you are?" So, end quote. So that's, we meet Ruby Turpin at the end of the story, and she's watering down, as you might remember, watering down the 7 hogs in the pen there. And suddenly, all that has happened to her has come to a head. and she's furious and angry, and she's raising her fist to the heavens and confronting God. So, my question to you, how does this confrontation with God at the pig parlor open her eyes to the final visionary light that she experiences at the end of the story? And if you remember, at the end of the story, she has this vision, and she sees all of these souls on their way to heaven. You know, the rich and the poor, the trashy, the white, the black, all of them on their way. And who trails up at the very end is herself and people like her and her husband, Claude. Okay? So there are 3 questions I'd like to have you think about. And if you could just select 2 of them, and if you could respond to me in a very brief sort of reflection response, that would be terrific. Okay? I think that should be pretty clear. So what we had before us this morning is one of Flannery O'Connor's really interesting short stories. And it's a story that's sort of, in some ways, kind of shocking in a way, because the conclusion of the story leaves us wondering, you know, what happens next. And so I think it's kind of sort of important to try to read the story. And I think which is always so important is to try to place yourself in the story with the characters as you listen carefully what's being said, as you observe what's being done. So that's very, very important. So once again, a question that we ask ourselves in reading any form of good literature is, what was the intent of the writer? What was O'Connor expressing about life and about human relationships and about the human condition? And so, basically, what is this short story about, Good Country People? First of all, what helps is just take a look at the setting itself as part of the plotting. The story takes place in a small country farm in southern Georgia. The farm is owned and operated by a woman who is named Mrs. Hopewell. Again, keep in mind that's oftentimes titles and names and various colors are significant as part of O'Connor's sort of style. Living with Mrs. Hopewell is her 32-year-old daughter, Joy. What we know about Joy is that she changed her name to Hulga, and that she earned a PhD in philosophy, and that she has an artificial leg. Mrs. Hopewell has hired tenants. They're the Freemans, Mr. and Mrs. Freeman, who help run the farm with her. And we also discover, although they don't appear in the story as such, they had 2 teenage daughters as well. We are introduced in the course of the story to an outsider, a Bible salesman by the name of Manly Pointer, who strikes up a relationship with Mrs. Hopewell's daughter, Hulga. And the time is around the late 1950s. So that's pretty much the setting. So it takes place in a small farm, and all within a period of 24 hours. We say with the short story, time, place, and event is somewhat limited, although the time actually runs for a couple of days. In the story, Good Country People, there are 4 basic characters here. There's Mrs. Hopewell, the owner of the farm, her daughter Hulga, and then the hired tenant, Mrs. Freeman, and then the visiting Bible salesman, Manly Pointer. What we have to do is to ask ourselves, what do we know about these characters? What kind of individuals are they? What can we discover about them? And for each of us, as we read the story, we need to imagine ourselves being part of the story. And then, as such, then we could perhaps better understand and describe the characters themselves. But I think with O'Connor, and especially with this story, there are some assumptions that we have to make regarding the story itself. First of all, O'Connor is writing Christian fiction. I think that's the fact. That's what we're dealing with. This is Christian fiction. You'll notice that there's always a spiritual message within the story. And for her, it was a challenge because she always found it a problem to relate her Christian message, especially trying to get it across to an audience to whom her message was meaningless. And so as a result of that, you'll notice that O'Connor has to write with large, bold images, and for us to grasp what it is that this Christian message might be. So that's one of the assumptions, that her stories carry fundamentally and basically a message, a spiritual message, theological message, if you will. Secondly, she's also using the natural dialogue of the people, who are, for the most part, uneducated, poor, conservative, white, and African American Southern characters. And so sometimes we can be put off by the language, by the local dialect, the poor grammar that we read as we're reading the stories. But that's what she's using. She's using the natural language of the people, of her characters. She uses also the anagogical vision in telling her story. In other words, there is meaning above the literal facts. There's something above the actual events and the characters. So if you remember, I think a couple of classes ago, we talked about the analogical vision of O'Connor. And it's a technique that it's important to keep that in mind as we read her stories. And also, another assumption is that there is always an excessive use of irony used in describing her characters and some of the events. That's so pretty evident in reading her stories. Another observation, consideration, is that in all of her stories, she brings her characters to a moment when it is no longer possible for them to continue in their accustomed manner. Oftentimes, they're blind assumptions. So all of her characters, it seems, particularly her main characters, come to a point in the story where they are confronted about who they are and what they're doing. Just for example, the proud are so oftentimes repeatedly humbled. The ignorant are repeatedly enlightened. The wise are repeatedly shown that the wisdom of this world is foolishness in the eyes of God. The materialists are repeatedly forced to recognize that the treasures of this world are theirs to possess, but for a brief time only. Her characters frequently gain their new awareness as a result of having undergone some form of epiphany. Often these epiphanal moments come by way of violence and destruction. Just to give you an example in the stories that we've read, the murder of Mr. Guzak, again, that moment of epiphany, and how it affected the characters, or the violent death of Julian's mother at the hands of the African American woman. We have the goring of Mrs. May and her death by the bull in Greenleaf. We have the loss of Hulga's artificial leg up in the hayloft in Good Country People, and then we have the violent attack of Mrs. Ruby Turpin by Mary Grace in Revelation. So it seems that these moments of awareness, these moments, these epiphanal moments where the characters finally come to a moment of awareness, is oftentimes come through way of violence and destruction. In 11 of her 19 stories, at least from the first short story collection, death of one or more of the characters is used to produce this epiphany, this awareness, and this awakening. In the remaining stories, the character's epiphany is produced by the destruction of a beloved possession or by the rendering of an intellectual veil which had protected the character from the knowledge of his or her own true ignorance. It serves as a vehicle for O'Connor's theology of illuminating grace. It is the grace that she understands, again, part of her theology, is that God provides this illuminating grace, this gift of grace to the individual. And it's up to the individual to either accept or to reject this grace. And oftentimes, when the grace is given by God, the character runs from it or turns from it, and sometimes there's a kind of a heavy-handed sort of knock on the head that suddenly stops the person and enables the person to turn around and to accept or to reject God's grace. And the interesting part about this is that the grace of God enables the person to see himself or herself in true light. It enables the person to become more fully aware of their person, their humanity, their flaws, their sinfulness, and thus bringing about, one hopes, conversion or a turning about. So what's interesting again about the O'Connor stories is that she doesn't really, we don't oftentimes know how the character plays out in the end, because we're not oftentimes given any kind of tidy conclusion. It's up to us as readers and as observers of this world of these characters to try to understand, well, what became of them? How do they accept this sudden illuminating grace, oftentimes coming to them in violent ways? So, in all of her stories, and I think this is kind of important to remember, and sometimes people will say, oh, I'm off put by O'Connor's stories, they're so violent, they're seem so sort of frightening in a way. But in all of her stories, O'Connor never uses violence for its own sake. It's only used as a logical extension of the action of the story itself. Okay. So anyway, they're just some of the assumptions, these 4 or 5 assumptions that we can make about reading her stories. So I wanted to take for a few more moments, take a look at a couple of the characters. We have these 4 major characters in the story: Mrs. Hopewell, her daughter Hulga, Mrs. Freeman, who seems to be kind of a hanger-on, she's there, and then there's the visiting Bible salesman. So we ask ourselves, in this story, who amongst them is the protagonist? Who is the antagonist? We do hear from Mrs. Hopewell in all of her platitudes and her cliches that she recognizes Mrs. Freeman as good country people. We also recognize her finally suggesting that the Bible salesman, the 19-year-old Manly Pointer, also as good country people. And when she speaks of good country people, she's referring to essentially simple farm folk who don't have any pretensions. They kind of live out a day-to-day life doing what they're expected to do. They're essentially good people, and so she's anointing, as it were, Mrs. Freeman and the Bible salesman as such. Now, we also notice that there's a clear, definite conflict between Mrs. Hopewell and her daughter, Joy Hulga. So let's take just a very brief look at, for example, Mrs. Hopewell. Almost always she speaks in empty cliches, empty sayings, such as, well, nothing is perfect. That's life. Well, everyone has their opinion. I always said it to myself. So she uses these, you'll hear this throughout the whole of the story, these empty sort of cliches, these sort of meaningless, vague statements that she has, that she understands about it. And that's, in some ways, it sort of reflects and depicts her as a kind of a shallow woman of no substance. She calls Mrs. Freeman good country people, and she views the Freeman family as simple people and hires them when no one else would. And she feels that she has the upper hand and that she, in a sense, controls Mrs. Freeman by allowing her to be nosy, as you remember reading that. But what, in fact, is actually Mrs. Freeman who has the advantage over her. It's rather very subtle. Mrs. Hopewell somehow survives in a self-made world of illusion, isolating herself from the real world by mouthing these pseudo-philosophical cliché maxims, which also isolate her from her daughter, who has a PhD in philosophy. Mrs. Hopewell cannot reconcile herself to a daughter who was different. It would seem that she would like to brag about her daughter. She can brag about Mrs. Freeman's teenage daughters, Glenise and Caramay, by telling people they are two of the finest people she knows. But she is deeply ashamed of her daughter's name, the way she dresses, her behavior, even her PhD. As she tells us, it would be much easier for her to say, my daughter is a teacher, or my daughter is a nurse, or my daughter is a secretary. But she can't say to people, my daughter is a philosopher. And she somehow says, well, that's really part of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. I mean, she's confused about the daughter's position with her PhD. So all through the first part of the story, Hulga is attempting to reveal her mother's blindness, her lack of awareness of the real world, the emptiness of her good country people philosophy, while all the time she herself reveals the vast weakness and hypocrisy in her own professed atheistic views, laying her open later on for Manly Pointer's attacks. As far as Hulga goes, O'Connor is showing us here that Hulga, with her PhD degree in philosophy, has until now professed absolute atheism. To Hulga, there is no God and there is no afterlife. She has believed herself to be an iron-willed rationalist, as indicated by the underlined passage in one of her books that her mother stumbled upon and attempted to read. By the way, the passage is actually from Heidegger's Existence and Being at the top of page 277 of our text. At the same time, however, we see that Hulga unconsciously wants to believe that there is a power greater than herself. And she keeps reminding the mother that we are not our own light. There's something more. So subconsciously, she deeply desires something to which she might surrender herself, as she later does to the Bible salesman advances. Thus, ironically, in pointing out her mother's blindness, Helga has revealed to us that she herself is blind about her own desires and her own view of reality. So, what do we make of the climax of this story? What was Helga's purpose in meeting with the salesman? How did she view him? What was her intention of going off on this so-called date with Manly Pointer? Was it purely a romantic sort of outing? What was she intending to do? You have to remember as you read the story how she perceived his Christian simplicity, his Christian faith, as she thought that she was going to somehow turn that up inside out, turn it on his head, as it were. But as we discover at the end of the story, he turns it on her. And I won't go in at this time to the end of the story, because I think you know the end of the story. It's rather shocking. They're up on the hayloft, and so at the end of the story, I guess I want you to be thinking about what has it all come down to. Where was and how was this illuminating grace offered to this character, Joy Helga? How does she end up in the end of the story itself? Okay, that's everything for today. I will definitely look forward to your responses. You can select 2 of those 3 questions I gave you regarding Revelation. You can turn those in on Friday, and it's always sort of interesting and fun to get your responses. So I hope you have the next couple of days will be peaceful for you, and that all is well. You're staying healthy, and I hope your family are all blessed and healthy as well. So I will be chatting with you again on Friday morning. Take care. Bye-bye.